So the Delaware Shorebird Project, or DSP, as you might see it noted in this presentation, it's a team of local, regional, and international biologists that come together around both coasts of the Delaware Bay, New Jersey and Delaware, to understand the mass migratory event that happens here each spring as birds stop here on their way north to breeding grounds. On the Delaware side, this project is run by me and my team through the DNREC Division of Fish and Wildlife, specifically the Wildlife Species Conservation and Research Program. But other notable partners include people in fisheries, parks, as far as the state goes, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, and some of our primary partners are the UK's Wash-Wader Research Group, which is a UK-based shorebird, or as they call them, waders, research and banding group that developed a lot of the methodologies that we use. It's a little late at night for most of them, but I notice one of our other partners, Emma, is on the call. So thanks for joining, Emma, all the way from Argentina. So we are doing all this work here in this region of the Delaware Bay, and you might wonder why there's such a mass effort at so many different scales to do this work here. This map, which I used last year too, and the color hasn't gotten any less unfortunate, shows specifically the yellow is tag paths from tagged shorebirds, so giving location data around shorebirds. And you can see that, you know, while a lot of these tags are sort of dispersed around a lot of the globe, there's this mass accumulation of tag tracks in the Delaware Bay area. That's partially because we put a lot of tags out on shorebirds here, but we are able to put a lot of tags out because we have so many birds. So a very unusual proportion of these birds' populations stop in this relatively small area right in our backyard each year. And if you're noticing that some of these tracks seem to span, you know, the entire globe, then I would say good spotting to you, because that is true. The most kind of famous of these migratory shorebirds that we're going to be talking about is the red knot. The subspecies that we get is called the Rufa red knot, and some of their wintering populations are located all the way down in Tierra del Fuego at the far southern end of South America, and breed up in Arctic, like far North Arctic Canada, but they tend, a large number of their population stops here on the way to make that journey. What that's called is a stopover location. So for the birds that we're talking about, we're not where they breed, we're not where they spend their winter time, we are just where they stop during a long migration. And the reason they do that is because we have this absolutely insane horseshoe crab spawn that goes on each spring. So the Delaware Bay is one of the most notable places in the world for the mass horseshoe crab horseshoe crab spawn that occurs here each spring, where horseshoe crabs come up onto the beach, dig down into the sand and lay their eggs. These birds then come in mass and are eating the exposed eggs, either through, kind of probing through the first few layers of sand, and also the wave action turns over the sand and exposes the eggs. The eggs, as you can imagine, like you eating eggs for breakfast, it's like a great source of protein and fat. That's a very high energy and easily digestible way to get energy to complete these absolutely massive migrations. The birds tend to leave here and then fly, often in kind of one long journey with maybe small stops along the way, all the way up high into Canada. And when they get there, they're doing a breeding season, which is an energetically taxing process to begin with. So they need to have a good body condition by the time they leave Delaware in order to make that journey and have a successful breeding season. So part of the history, if you're familiar with this will sound like something you've heard before, but part of the history of the bay is there was a massive crash in the horseshoe crab populations, and then a corresponding crash in the shorebirds that relied on them. So if you're thinking about this system and these birds are traveling so far to get here and, fatten up, if there's a sudden change in the availability of that food, it's going to cause mass difference, like losses in survival getting up into the breeding territory, as well as just lower success in breeding because more birds are not able to successfully go through that entire process. So this population crash in the horseshoe crabs and subsequently the birds was caused by massive overharvests in the horseshoe crab industry. horseshoe crabs are harvested for a number of things, but in the 90s and early 2000s, the bait harvest increased because they started being used as bait in other fisheries more so than they previously had, and it just led to a mass increase in harvest in a way that then had a very distinct effect on the Delaware Bay beaches and the birds that rely on them. So there was corresponding catastrophic declines in red knot seen in the Delaware Bay as well as elsewhere. They weren't all just going other places. There were population losses, and they were, the birds that were still around after these tough years were often going to other stopovers rather than the Delaware Bay. This initiated a worldwide conservation effort related to red knots and other shorebirds that's now expanded, across the globe, but some of the first efforts and major research being done on these species were being done here in the Delaware Bay, led by biologists and activists who are still around doing this work. That led to the formation of the Delaware Shorebird Project, which is us. So we are a group of people that, formed around tracking the progress of population recovery as the fishery management started. And the project has evolved over the years, but we're still contributing to some of these same long-term data sets that started in the 90s and early 2000s when the project started. I'm not going to go into as much detail about our methods as I did at this talk last year, which might still be available online. So if you're curious, you could probably get more detail looking there. But this is kind of a, separated stepwise way of looking at some of the work that we do. So when we have the birds present in Delaware, which is usually only for a peak of 3 or 4 weeks in May and early June, we try to get as much data out of this situation as possible because these birds tend to be really dispersed around the globe and often in hard to reach places. But when they're in Delaware Bay, they're right in front of us in very dense flocks, and it's a great time to get a better understanding of what's going on in that population just by looking at what we've got going on here. So to complete that, first off, kind of the simplest on the surface is we just do coastwide surveys around the bay. So we go to a bunch of different sites along the bay shore, count flocks, identify what species are here, and also complete a couple of aerial surveys throughout the season where a plane takes off at kind of the southern New Jersey edge of the bay and circles the entire bay in one swoop, counting some of our target species. So we get, a single day count that we call our peak count because we aim to do that flight around when we expect peak numbers of birds to occur. So that'll give us kind of our highest single day counts that we'll get. While we're doing these coastwide surveys, we're also looking into flocks of birds for individually marked birds. And the way that we get that information is by capturing birds and applying field readable flags. So what that means is, as opposed to like a metal bird band that you may have seen on some species, a field readable flag is a completely unique code for that bird. So every unique combination of species, color, and code will belong to only one bird in the world, and you can read that code from a distance without having to capture the bird. Usually just using a camera, binoculars, or a spotting scope, you're able to positively identify that bird. That'll give us kind of individual patterns for birds year over year. In the process of capturing birds, to put those flags on, we also collect a lot of other data, including their weight, which is relevant when you're at a stopover where you're interested in the potential for weight gain throughout a season. As well as we can collect feathers from these birds that allow us to determine their wintering location using the isotope signatures in the feathers. We'll get into that more later. We also just generally, from getting these flags out, are able to track individual data over time, such as migratory connectivity, like where they go next, where they stop in the winter, where they stop on their way down south. Lifespans, differences in survival rates in different years based on, when we stop seeing birds, as well as apply geolocators or tags that allow more precise location information to be collected. We can then multiply that data that we collect at the individual level to population level implications, both for our stopover population here and kind of the specific things that go on in the Delaware Bay with the portion of the population that stops here in a given year, as well as, kind of trying to help contribute to understanding global trends since we have such great access to these birds in a way that isn't common everywhere else. And we'll take a look at some of that. And then all of that contributes to better understanding and more effective management of the complicated system that goes into, shorebird well-being in the world. Here's a look a little bit at some of our coastwide surveys. This is a map of the sites that we survey as part of our project. We really focus on that kind of mid area of the Delaware Bay. That's where we tend to see the most spawning and the most birds. The area in the pink square is Mispillion Harbor, where the Nature Center is located. And that's where we get the most spawning and the most birds. And it's pretty much exclusively where we get red knot in the state of Delaware at this point. And that's just because that harbor area with its many different kind of shallow beaches, warmer, shallower water, great spot for horseshoe crab spawning. And then the birds kind of want to be wherever the horseshoe crabs are. During our surveys, we are doing flag resighting, so getting those individual metrics, as well as counting the ratios of marked to unmarked birds, so flagged to unflagged birds, because if you know that on average throughout a season, and you know how many flags you've put out into a population and average rates of turnover, you can use those metrics to start to understand what your total population is just using some complicated ratios there. And we also do that aerial survey I mentioned that covers the entire bay. Our target species when we're doing this work, so the things we're paying the most attention to that are the most likely to have flags either put on by us or other projects are the red knot, ruddy turnstone, sanderling, semi-palmated sandpiper, and short-billed dowager, which is a species we added as a target species just last year, alongside some partners in New Jersey who started putting flags on them just a year or two ago. So it's very exciting. We're going to be among the first to start learning more movement details about that species. I just listed all those target species and some others that we see, and I did manage to find a picture where you can see all of them. So any of you birders might already know who some of these guys are, but you can take a look. I've included circles for the unique species that we count in our surveys here. And then there's your little key to that. So you've got your very brightly colored kind of black, white, and orange ruddy turnstone on the far left. We'll be talking about them a lot more later in the talk. Blurred out in the background is our short-billed dowager, which is our new target species that we added. You can see they have some similarities to the red knot in front of them. They're tall, they're bigger than a lot of these other birds, and they have that red chest, but when you see them compared to a red knot, it's pretty clear who's who. The short-billed dowager has a very long bill, just not as long as a long-billed dowager, and its red chest is a lot less bright and less extensive than on the red knot. Their backs are more of a brown spotted color, whereas the red knot are kind of a white and black barring situation. The two that are the trickiest for most people, definitely myself included, is the semi-palmated sandpiper and the sanderling. The two birds look very similar in a lot of their plumage. They just is a size difference. I mean, there's other differences as well, but primarily what you're noticing is a size difference, which is great when they're right next to each other, a little harder when they're not. And then as a bonus, we've included the dunlin on the side there, which is another shorebird that we commonly get in our bays. No projects that we know of are currently flagging those birds, so we don't have to pay nearly as close attention to looking for those flag codes, but we are still tracking population counts for that species. Here's another look at just kind of what a mixed flock in Mispillion can look like. This was a picture one of my team took last year of just a water line on an average beach in Mispillion as the birds are looking for eggs. So as you can see, there's a bunch of those species that we just highlighted are in this photo. Dunlin towards the front, some dowager, red knot, a couple of turnstone mixed in there, lots of semi-palmated sandpipers. So when we're doing these coastwide surveys, while that sounds simple, there is definitely a lot of skill and training involved in getting even close to accurate counts of what's going on these beaches. We aren't sitting out there trying to count every individual, but you need to have a really good idea of what you're looking at when you're looking into a flock this dense. And be able to figure out approximately how many birds you're looking at and what the approximate species composition of that flock is. When it comes to our other work, there's a bunch of pictures of Emma in here, which is nice. Glad he's here to see it. Our banding and flagging work that we do most of our captures using cannon nets, which is a common technique when you're dealing with flocks this large, is that you're able to kind of send one large net out and cover a huge flock of birds at once. We work with the Washwader Research Group that have really honed a lot of these methods on their research sites that they're working at constantly throughout the year, and then they come and bring that expertise to us to help us work on our sites for just the couple of weeks that we need it. So we're able to catch often hundreds of birds under these nets. And there's, a very strict system for how we get birds out, get them under cover and calm, and then go do our full processing work to get them out as quickly as possible, but get as much data and marked birds out in these populations as possible in order to be able to contribute to the science. These flags, here's a couple examples of what they look like. So the picture that's more zoomed out, you can just see sort of a hint of plastic in there on a red knot's leg. So they're not super obvious from a distance, but if you look at some of these more zoomed in photos, they are a pretty red knot and shorebird dowliger, which are these two species, are some of the easiest to read flags on because they're so tall. But you can see the codes are nice and clear right on a big piece of plastic there that's able to be read. And the color of the flag corresponds to what country it was put out in. So North American color, or not North America, the US color for this scheme is this light green that you can see here with black ink. So some of these species, like the red knot and the reddy turnstone, have actually been flagged for so long and so extensively that we've run out of codes, even including symbols like you see in the top flag there. So we've actually expanded to using dark green as well. So you could see a flag that's light green with black ink or dark green with white ink now that we've done that to start getting access to more codes for these birds. While we've got the birds in hand, there's a lot of other things that we do with them. It may seem crazy how much we can do with them, but actually we process these birds really quickly because we're catching such a high number of them. We need to get them, kind of through this whole situation and out back released into the wild as quickly as we can. Most teams, when they're in a flow are doing a bird a minute. Everyone's kind of sitting in a semicircle and everyone has a specific job and everyone's got a bird in hand at all times and you're just sort of playing hot potato with the bird. Doing your task and getting it around that circle. And most of the birds, from the time they're picked up to start this process to the time they're put back either into a box for release or just released straight onto the beach, depending where this catch is occurring, it's about 1 minute, sometimes less. So some of the things that we are collecting in that process are morphology measurements, so body measurements like weight, bill length, measures of their wing and tarsus. Actually, we don't do tarsus on these birds, but wing, bill length, things like that. We apply those field readable flags. Sometimes we are also applying satellite tags. So that's done by a specialized team that has experience in that. And we'll get to look at some of that data and how those tags work in a minute. Our resite data that we then get from the flags for these individuals is able to tell us things about site fidelity. So that's how often do they come back to sites like Delaware or their wintering locations? Are they kind of moving around, or are certain birds really, stick into a site and they go there every year? Does that change based on conditions in a given year? Things about bird lifespan and survival, patterns across years, things like that. Patterns in timing when the birds are arriving and leaving, all of that we are really only able to get because we have individually marked birds in these populations. And we aim to mark somewhere between 5 and 10% of our population. That's not it's tough to reach that kind of number with how big these populations are. I think we're hovering around 5% right now, but having about 5 to 10% of your population marked is the way to get the best data out of these individual flags. We also collect feathers from some species. Right now we're only collecting them from red knot, but I mentioned this earlier. When we have these feathers, you can actually do an analysis of the chemical isotopes that make up the feathers. And for red knot specifically, the two locations that they spend their winters for the most part are the northern wintering birds, which are around the coast of Brazil, and the further south wintering birds near Tierra del Fuego. Those areas are distinct enough that actually where the bird is when they grow that feather in over the winter affects the chemical makeup of that feather and the timing of it. So we are able to distinguish using the carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios in the feather where that bird spent the winter. And that can be really critical when we're talking about these populations that may experience really different conditions over the winter. A population, could look stable to only slightly decreasing if you're just looking in the Delaware Bay, because we're just seeing what's in front of us and what arrived here. We can go into that isotope data and say, actually, normally we have about a 50-50 split of Brazil versus far south birds. This year, you know, it was 80% Brazil birds. What happened to the further south birds, and things that may look like a minor trend, if you're able to parse apart those subpopulations, may actually be something really significant happening in only one subpopulation. So that was one of the first things when we realized that we could do this with the feather isotopes and separate these subpopulations, that made the Delaware Bay extremely valuable to understanding global conservation of shorebirds, because we're able to pull those types of conclusions about areas so far from us and dealing with, you know, conditions that would otherwise maybe be hard to pull apart when you're just looking at these flocks, or if they're in areas that are difficult to access. Here's a couple just examples of figures that we can pull from a single year of our own data. So when I talk about weight, and one of the most valuable things that we get from capturing the birds, in addition to putting those flags out, is that weight data. So you can see that on the figure that's orange and black over here. This is our ruddy turnstone weight on average from this year in the black, mapped against their weight on that date every other year previous. And this project has been going on long enough that we can do that, where there's enough captures for the most part, especially in that peak part of the month where we expect a lot of birds, where we can, you know, we've probably caught ruddy turnstone on, you know, 10 different May 20ths, and we can average those together and see how this May 20th compared. And that timing is relevant because the birds are expected to arrive skinny and leave fat. So you want to compare to a similar point in the month going back in time. You can see for this year, some of the data that looks a little crazier, or that doesn't really have error bars there, may have been because we only caught a single bird, because we were doing some small captures in individual walk-in traps this year as part of our tagging project for this species. But for the most part, 2025 started maybe a bit above average in the early part of the month, and then kind of had a fall off towards closer to average in the later part of the month. And that would have been kind of expected based on what we saw on the ground, because we did have pretty strong start to the season here, with lots of spawning and lots of birds arriving and seeming to be able to get their fill. And then there was that, if you recall, May got really cold out of nowhere. There was some big storms, the water temperature dropped, and spawning slowed way down. We actually had birds sticking around Delaware for much later into spring than we normally do, probably trying to just get more food and get fattened up a bit more before they headed out. So while it doesn't look, you know, extremely different than previous seasons, we could see that maybe the early part of the season we were on track to be maybe a bit above average, and with that dip in spawning, things kind of evened out towards the middle of the season. The figure on the other side just shows a single site flock count throughout the period there, with a bunch of our different target species. So you can see how at all these different visits to this site, the number of species on that beach changes a lot throughout the season, and the composition. This is a beach that seems to be pretty popular with sanderling. This is Brockenbridge, I believe, Delaware Wildlands property. Red knot don't seem to use this land very much, neither do dowitchers, but we can see that turnstone, semi-palmated sandpipers, and sanderlings really do. And that spike kind of around like May 21st area, I think was associated with, we had some peregrine falcons that were spending their time in Mispillion Harbor and hunting the flocks there, ended up causing a mass dispersal to other sites. So sites that didn't typically have as much activity, right around that May 19th, 20th region, a bunch of the flocks showed up there as they were finding Mispillion not to be a very friendly area for foraging at that time, which is great. It means that there were some backups that these birds could go to. Ultimately, those peregrines moved on when the shorebird flocks weren't there to be playthings anymore, and the shorebirds all came back into the harbor by a few days later. Some other of our bigger implications that we can draw from these surveys that we do include mapping these peak aerial counts over time. So this aerial survey, where a plane goes around the whole bay, has been going on annually since the late 80s. And because of that, we've got this beautiful long-term data set that we can look at to see these trends. And you can see, you know, towards that earlier side of the graph, the numbers of red knot in the blue, you know, they oscillate a lot year to year, because a peak count is a pretty hard thing to time. You're not necessarily always catching the peak. as well as the fact that Delaware Bay isn't the only stopover for these birds. Where the birds actually go in May varies a lot year to year. So it may have been that whatever that very big year is, looks like 1989, maybe that was a great year in the Bay and a ton of the birds stopped here. Maybe they didn't end up having that great of foraging that year because it looks like in 1990, if we assume that the peak count did catch a near peak count, only about half that many came back. So there is a lot of variability in this data set, just as a natural response to what the data is, being a single day count, as well as the fact that the birds do go to massively different places each year. You can see, though, in later years, especially around the early 2000s, those numbers dropped a lot, especially for the red knot, and then kind of subsequently maybe a slower decline in the ruddy turnstone that are considered less specialized on horseshoe crab eggs, but that may have still felt the effects of that, as well as effects in other ecological pressures in their range. We've had a lot of variability still going forward, but around 2012, we started to see some effects where the average, the 3-year moving average of our red knot counts has been going up since the more effective management of the horseshoe crab fishery started. The horseshoe crabs and the birds are both long-lived, so it takes a while for these things to have an effect, but there does seem to be a generally positive trend. There was surprisingly low counts in 2021 and 2022 that then haven't really been played out the last few years. So it may have just been a year where either somehow we missed the peak or the birds were elsewhere. That one's a bit of a mystery for all of us as well. We did end up publishing a full report this year between my agency, New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife that you can access through, we have a link to it on the DNREC Shorebird Research and Monitoring Report. Yeah, and Reagan just linked it right there. Thank you. That goes over the full methodology for this survey going all the way back to the 80s, because there have been changes that do affect, the way that the data was collected. There's been changes in observer, which is a big deal when you're talking about, who's counting all these birds for this multi-hour survey. How familiar they are with that does affect the quality of the count, and it has naturally over the course of several decades changed a couple of times. But you can see the full breakdown of these numbers, as well as how the birds were distributed between the two states, because that's changed quite a lot recently. And more details just about how this survey works if you're curious. Another thing that we're able to contribute is a different type of population analysis. So while the aerial count is that single day trying to capture a peak, cross-section type analysis, there's also a work that we contribute to that calculates an estimated passage population analysis, which is the total number of birds that come through the bay throughout the spring migration. And this funnel graphic up, because that's been helpful in describing this. So when you're talking about the bay, if the bay is our funnel, we've got birds that are constantly arriving throughout the month as well as constantly leaving. So earlier in the month, there's going to be more birds arriving than leaving. Later in the month, there's going to be more birds leaving than arriving. But no single day in that time captures the total of birds that actually came through the bay. Some had already escaped out the bottom of that funnel or not yet arrived. So this is a complicated mathematical process that has to do with some of that ratios that I was mentioning before related to our marked to unmarked ratios that we calculate, the individual flag resighting, as well as a bunch of other factors that go into this mark recapture statistical model that then allows us to calculate the estimated full population that passed through the bay in total based on the work that we all do while we're out on the beaches. So that's one of the most critical things that we contribute to the management of these populations. We get our data turned around very quickly after the season, and this data gets fed directly into this model and then reported to fisheries management and environmental agencies to help make decisions for the following year. So it's a very live decision-making process based on the data that our project's collecting, which is really cool. This data also lets us calculate things like arrival and departure rates, that kind of changing rate of who's coming in and who's coming out, as well as about how long birds are staying for. Currently, this analysis is only done annually for red knot, but there's the There's been progress towards doing this for ruddy turnstone, and Jim Lyons, who created this model, has already run some of that historic data for our ruddy turnstone, and there could be more species-specific analysis coming up. You can find the annual reports of this data also linked on our website in the same spot as the other report I mentioned. I think we've got the last several years linked right on our main page. We don't have 2025's full report yet due to the government shutdown and some other changes at the federal level. There's that report has not been able to be approved for final release yet. But I've seen it. It's great report. Can't wait for you all to get to see it. So here's a little bit of that type of data. So this table we've got at the top here is from one of those reports from Jim Lyons that I mentioned. So he includes both the peak count aerial survey data in a given year, as well as the estimated total population. And you can see sometimes they kind of match, where a low year is connected with a low year in the estimated population survey. Sometimes they're not as connected, and that's when we look at trying to understand any disparities. Sometimes it would appear that we missed the peak in some way. Other times it's just a year where there was higher turnover. So if birds were kind of coming in and leaving more rapidly, the peak count is going to detect less because there's fewer present on any given, kind of cross-section type day. Whereas the estimated population model that's getting an individual flag resites and ratios there will be able to capture more of that turnover. There has been a relative stabilization in the data in the last few years. These confidence intervals you can see, which is what's in parentheses, are highly overlapping, which indicates that there's not been major shifts in any particular direction. As a spoiler alert, I'll say the 2025 estimate as well as the peak count were both higher this year than they had been for the previous several years looking at this. So it seemed like a higher number of the red knot total were visiting the bay this year, and we were able to capture that through both methods. There has been a major shift in where the birds are located. So for red knot specifically, it used to be maybe alternating which state they were more biased towards. For the most part, there's usually been some bias towards New Jersey in those species, where they're staying more of the population is in New Jersey. They've got a longer coastline. They've got more kind of protected vegetated areas and islands. They can have a couple more birds occasionally. That difference has gotten absolutely drastic over the last 5 years, where this year on that aerial survey that we did, less than 0.5% of all red knot in the bay were seen in Delaware. It was a good year for red knot in general. It was a high number, higher than we'd had in years, but they were simply all in New Jersey. And we can discuss some of my ideas for reasons that could be, and other scientists' opinions on what we need to look at to better understand that. When we look at our feather analyses that I mentioned, we're not detecting any disparities or real changes between different subpopulations. So when you're thinking about, we had this point source of a population crash related to horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs have started to be managed. Shorebird population has started to go up. Horseshoe crab populations have continued to increase. But the bird populations that we're seeing here have not kind of followed that same trend. They no longer seem like they're directly tied to each other. And stable does not necessarily mean increasing. And we know that most shorebird populations are decreasing at a pretty significant rate. So we want to understand why, if we can't necessarily directly tie this to horseshoe crab abundance in total, why are these population numbers for red knot and other shorebirds that we're seeing not increasing? Going over some of the potential threats in Delaware that are making or maybe suppressing some of that potential growth, or making it so that we aren't as good of a stopover as we historically were. There's probably a changing timeline or phenology between bird arrival and crab spawning as the climate changes and water temperatures change. The crab spawning and the bird arrival may no longer be as tightly linked as they have been in the years previous, which then may make it so that while there's, more crabs than there necessarily needs to be based on historic levels, they're spawning too early or too late, and the birds aren't able to access that food source. They're also, especially in Delaware, we're thinking potentially some loss or degradation of their roosting habitat. So roosting is resting, or where overnight or during the day when they're not foraging, the areas that they go to rest, maybe during high tide when they don't have exposed eggs, and again overnight. A lot of marsh has just been degraded related to development, sea level rise, and all sorts of other projects that may reduce both the amount of that habitat available and its quality. Changes in the vegetation community, maybe major growth in some of these areas of vegetation, not allowing them to be valid roosts anymore, as well as the increased abundance of human-associated predators. We see this with a lot of birds related to red fox in particular that tend to thrive around human communities where they can steal food and things, and then their populations expand and they become much more significant predators for shorebirds and other breeding animals than they would have been in more of a natural state. We also have some potential that there's been loss or degradation of foraging beaches. So beaches are a very dynamic environment. They're expected to kind of erode and change, and beach in one place will disappear and form in another place. However, because of things like coastal development, not every location where a beach may form is necessarily a valid shorebird location, or there's just restrictions based on other infrastructure that doesn't allow beaches to form in certain places that may affect and increase rates of erosion, increase the slope of our beaches so that perhaps there's not as much like intertidal beach where horseshoe crabs are able to come up, lay eggs, and then shorebirds are able to forage them, changing shape and slope affecting how much of our horseshoe crabs that we have are laying eggs that are going to be accessible to shorebirds. And as well as human disturbance human and otherwise disturbance in areas where birds are. So if birds are coming here to try to fatten up, but they're spending the entire time that they're on a beach being chased by a dog, or kind of moved off of an area if they found a good spot of horseshoe crab eggs, but then a group of people ends up setting up camp there for the day, they're probably not going to be as effectively able to use that resource and gain energy from it than they would have been in a less disturbed state. Beyond the bay, there's other things that we like to think about because we have such an outsized impact here. Sometimes it can be easy to think, no matter what, if we do this, we're going to affect the population, and there may be other factors suppressing these birds' population growth outside of here that we also want to think about and figure out ways to assist in either gathering that information or contribute to the active science going on. So we have these birds for a couple weeks of the year. But they also experience threats on their breeding grounds, on their wintering grounds, and in the entire pathway in between. So there could be survival differences at any of these different stages. I've got on this side here a recent report related to horseshoe crab abundances, calculated by multiple different metrics that was published earlier last year. Going over all these different abundance indexes for horseshoe crabs, and it's seeming like our horseshoe crab numbers are going up. They started significantly increasing in the early 2000s. In the early 2010s, and we're getting kind of closer in our estimates to what we think some of these levels in the 90s were, where we didn't have significant shorebird losses, but we're not seeing a return to 1990s levels of shorebirds. What seems to have maybe happened is that this major crash in Delaware in the early 2000s caused absolutely acute population losses related to decreases in survival in that stage of migration, and a need to find other stopover sites that may have directly contributed to lowering those populations. And these species are sensitive, and they have long generations and long lifespans, and they're just kind of slow to respond. And it just may be that since the population may have already been being suppressed by a lot of other factors related that you hear in any kind of environmental context, habitat loss, climate change, all of these threats, and issues in the Delaware Bay knocked that population way down, and it hasn't been able to grow just by fixing the Delaware Bay because there's still all of these additional pressures. We want to do everything we can to make sure that the Delaware Bay is as good of a stopover location as it can be. So that's why we're always thinking about things like roost habitat, foraging beaches, never taking our, eyes off the road in relation to horseshoe crab harvest and keeping that at a manageable level. But we also want to think about some of these other pressures that may be affecting birds in the Delaware Bay and outside of it and hope to address them. So things like that could be related to that changing timing I mentioned with horseshoe crabs, changing timing at the breeding grounds. The birds go so far north that they actually really need to be carefully timed with the melting of the permafrost layer there to be able to successfully breed and then be able to get out of there before it starts to get too cold again. So these birds are really dependent on careful timing, and some of these cycles are just getting messed up at a rate that they never have before, the way that the climate is changing so rapidly. Changes in predator composition everywhere as again, climate changes, predator ranges are changing and affecting these birds. Qualities of their stopovers, and then threats on their wintering grounds or en route. There's still some shorebird hunting in some locations. In many places that's restricted for species. So species like red knot are not hunted in most countries, but there's still risks to these birds on these long journeys that they're making. So because partially we've got less red knot to work on here on the Delaware side, we've gotten a little creative. We've got all these amazing species and we still have this incredible migration phenomenon occurring here. What's some of the other work that we can be doing with the birds we do have to maybe answer questions that are relevant to red knot and other species? So we've added, as I mentioned, short-billed dowitcher to our target species list, and that's going to be contributing to a global information gathering effort on that species. I was just in meetings a lot of yesterday talking to folks from all over the U.S. and into South America and and Canada about kind of what our priorities are for learning more about these birds. And the Delaware Bay is kind of the location they're relying on the most for getting these flags out on birds and starting to collect these individual metrics. We want to be looking more at our roosting and foraging habitat here in Delaware while we try to understand why the red knot aren't here and what they're queuing in on in New Jersey that they may be preferring. And then over the last several years, we've had work with Ruddy Turnstone, both contributing our data to that passage population analysis I mentioned, as well as starting some tracking work using satellite tags. And this was started as an effort in partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS to look at range-wide movement, so everywhere they go. And we are doing some sub-projects on their Delaware Bay habitat. So these are the birds in question. These are already turnstone. They're kind of like the barroom brawler types of the shorebird world. They are just aggressive, feisty little things. Stocky, low, just they're awesome little birds. We use these low-tech Argos sunbird tags. So these are satellite tags that communicate with a satellite, not over a cellular network and not with towers and things like that. And they have a tiny solar panel on them that gives them a pretty impressive battery life. So these points that we get from them don't come in on any specific schedule. It's when there's a satellite pass that is able to connect effectively to the tag, we get a point. So it can be dozens of points in a single day. It can go a couple days where it doesn't happen, whether there's bad cloud cover and the battery hasn't charged as well, or there just hasn't been good satellite passes. These tags are small and light enough to be used on shorebirds. As that technology has improved in the last couple of years, it's really expanded biologists' ability to get tags on smaller and smaller birds without hindering them with too much weight that they can't handle. The tags themselves have a long lifespan. We've been using glue mounting techniques, which actually means usually our mounting fails before the tag does, and we usually have a tag that's just reporting from the ground for a little while. We just wanted to make sure that we weren't affixing permanent tags to these birds while some of the technology around these tags is still somewhat new. But we tend to mark our birds in May when they're here and get data through at least September. So it captures all their movement around the bay, their journey up to their breeding grounds, their breeding location, about how long they're at their breeding grounds, and then full or partial tracks for their trips south. And I've got an example here, which are very fun to look at. So what you're looking at here is data from a single tag. This was a tag put out in 2024 on a bird with a dark green flag, L37. We started putting tags out in 2024, did it last year as well, and we'll put our last group of tags out this year. We are doing the larger project in partnership with USGS and US Fish and Wildlife, who will be looking at the range-wide data. But DNREC was also able to sponsor a master's student, Jesse McNulty, who actually used to be my technician on this project, to do a master's looking specifically at movement around the Delaware Bay. So we'll have a much better idea of the type of habitat these birds are using here in Delaware through her work. And I'll show you one more map, but you'll notice that the birds spend a lot of time in Misbillion Harbor. They also seem to bounce towards those offshore breakwalls off of Cape Henlopen's The Point, and do spend some time around Fowler Beach as well, which you'll see more in the next bird here. So this was a bird from 2025, dark green K56, and you can see this one really actively moves between this kind of triangulation of sites. And it tends to be that overnight they're going to the breakwalls off Cape Henlopen, which makes sense. This type of bird, the ruddy turnstone, tends to roost on rocks. And those offshore breakwalls are both massive with a lot of space, and because they're offshore, there's no real threat from things like foxes. Foxes are not typically swimming out that far into the bay. They do spend some time also in the marshes and beaches around Fowler Beach. There's plenty of other sites they go to as well. I'll show you a more zoomed out map showing all the tags in a moment. But this did allow us to identify a common pattern amongst these birds that we never really knew about before, because we're not out on offshore breakwalls at night. We didn't know that the birds were headed out there. So this has been really, really informative for understanding where these birds are going at night. And it's going to be pretty different than a lot of the other types of shorebirds that don't like to roost on rocks. Here's a look. I believe this is all the 2024 tags, the zoomed out kind of full path. So that red is where we put the tags out, which is the Delaware Bay. You can see all these different tracks making their way up north to breeding grounds. And some of those birds just made it really far up there. Some of the tags fall off at some point up there. Those are the green X's that you see are the last point for a bird. But some of them do make it partially or all the way down towards their wintering grounds. And then we've also just got this movement showing all of the points in the Delaware Bay for that year. So you can see the main hubs are Misbillion, where all the red X's are. Those breakwalls we talked about, and Fowler. There's some points going up the coast, places like North Bowers Beach, pretty popular. And then some of these trader nasty birds go straight over to New Jersey and only report data from New Jersey for the rest of the season. But it's cool to see that some of our birds do move pretty actively between the states and where they go. When they're in New Jersey, the turnstone aren't known for making as long flights as much as the red knot are. So it's a little less common for them to cross the bay like that, but some of them do, as we can see. Oh, here's Emma again. What can you do to contribute to kind of this system? So really minimizing disturbance when you're out on the beaches at this time of year. So in the spring, and really any time when you're seeing foraging flocks or potential birds exhibiting maybe territorial behavior, where possible, it's great to just clear the area or be able to move around them. Restricting things like off-leash dogs or even leash dogs that are just, reacting to the birds, kids that are running towards them. As much as possible, it's great to share these areas and maybe bring those types of things to areas that don't currently have birds using them, especially when we're talking about spring migration. They are looking for these foraging hotspots, and if there's a group of birds in an area, it's probably because there's something that they find valuable in that area that they may not find if they get kind of forced along the beach. Staying up to date with local policies where you are relating to coasts to try to and informed about, what the latest data and science is saying, to just, be a voice in the ear of some of these legislators who make these choices. Attending talks like this, also a great way to learn sort of what the biologists who study these things are thinking and seeing out in the field. And then joining volunteer teams. So our whole project is largely volunteer based. So if you're interested in doing some field work, as it's called, this project can be a little intense. So if you have never done anything like this before, it might be something that you want to try out, join for a survey for a day or two, and see how you like it. There's other projects that we do that are really helpful called stewardship programs. So that's when we have folks that spend time on our beaches and kind of more speak to the public about some of the restrictions in the area or about what's happening with the birds and why they should care. So we have a long-running program for stewardship in our breeding bird area at the Point at Cape Henlopen State Park. Some of you might be volunteers with that. I see some familiar names. So people stand and hang out at the fences there at that closed area help, keep some accountability for members of the public to not go into those closed areas, as well as just let people know what's going on and try to keep a positive conservation message going out. We're also starting a similar program related to shorebirds. This is going to be our first year, and we're going to see how much we want to, like, where we're going to put out the call for volunteers. But in the coming years, we're going to hopefully have some folks that spend time on popular shorebird foraging beaches doing a similar public education message. So that is something to look out for. We have interest forms that I see Reagan put in the chat for this project related to the main field work. You can, if you follow a couple links through there, you would also find our beach nesting bird volunteer program, which is that one I mentioned, related to kind of protecting that closed area for our breeding birds, which are not the same species as I was just discussing, but still great conservation species in Delaware. And I think that's about all I have here. Got some photo credits, and you can look for some of these reports that I mentioned on our Shorebird Research and Monitoring website. And shoot me an email if you're ever curious about any of these things, or if you want to get involved in any of these programs and aren't seeing something that fits you or have any questions. I'll quit sharing for now, but if I need to go back and look at something, if anyone has questions, I'll start again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kat. It was really enjoyable to hear all about the research that your team does. I know a lot of visitors ask us, especially when you guys are shooting the cannon out. When people will be watching with their binoculars from the deck, very interested in learning about what you all are doing. Thank you for sharing the information about how to get involved as well. I personally have been able to help out with some of their research, and it is a really fun opportunity. So if you do get the chance, I definitely encourage you to check that out if you are interested. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I believe Jody has one if you'd like to um, do that.
Yeah, I'm reading your comment now, Jody. Yeah, so I've read that paper as well. It's so there was a study done related to kind of responsiveness to disturbance among different shorebird species under certain conditions, and it does seem like maybe red knot are among the most responsive to these instances where they might fully clear out of an area in a way that other birds may be a little more resilient and come back. The red knot, part of that may have to do with sort of how athletic they are. Maybe they're more willing to just like say, I'm out of here, I gotta go, and they'll make a longer flight to a new location. They may also just be naturally more cautious in these situations. That's definitely something I've considered as maybe being a factor in the distribution of birds between Delaware and New Jersey, and it's one of the reasons we're trying to do more work with public stewardship and maybe move towards some other ways to reduce disturbance on our beaches for these birds. Since a lot of New Jersey's coastline is able to have more closed beaches, the way that their legislation and their property ownership works is a lot different than what we have here in Delaware. Delaware, in the limited area that we have for coastline, we kind of have to learn to get the birds and the people to cohabitate a bit more than being able to just close whole stretches of beach that are connected directly to people's property. But I would say there is something to the fact that red knot maybe are more sensitive to that level of disturbance than some of our other species. I see another question that Reagan sent in. No, that map with the different beach sites, the question related to whether my site map that I pulled up at the beginning, way back here, if the colors meant anything. No, it was just ways to distinguish the different sections of beach. These aren't coded in any way related to the birds. We see our peak birds in Mispillion, but the other areas, it kind of depends on the year and, the exact shape of the beach, the conditions that they're getting, where the birds are hanging out outside of Mispillion. It really shifts from year to year. There was a question earlier up I saw related to horseshoe crab bait harvest, I think, and said that whether there are rules that have changed related to horseshoe crab use for bait. So the bait industry still exists. That's still horseshoe crabs are caught and used as bait in, I believe, mainly the whelk fishery. It's really effective for catching whelk, probably because the horseshoe crab I mean, maybe they just like stink a little bit is kind of what I've gotten the impression, is just that they're, very detectable to the whelk. It is still allowed, but there are significant limitations on it. So the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, or ASMFC, took this up as a charge at the time that the fishery was collapsing and it was being connected to um, the bird populations decreasing. And so they created this adaptive resources model that figures in, you know, abundances of horseshoe crabs, abundances of red knot, and spits out a harvest limitation that then gets kind of divvied up between the different regions. And it is a much stricter limitation than anything that was going on at the time of the crash. There's mixed perspectives on adaptive resource management. There always is. It's always a contentious topic. But I would say from what we see on the ground, at least in Delaware, it has been effective. There are horseshoe crab eggs available to these birds. And maybe there's other pressures that are kind of reducing our populations here a little bit. But yeah, so there are rule changes, but the bait harvest is still an industry that exists. It's a relatively small industry, and for the most part, when we issue permits in Delaware for a certain amount of harvest, we don't end up hitting that limit. But there is still some bait harvest. I think that was all the ones that I saw come through already, but if I missed you, feel free to send it again, or anybody with additional questions.
We have a couple more questions if you
Yeah.
would like to stick around. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, Ray, that's a good question. So we worry about that more with our breeding birds for the most part, because what happens is early in May, the gulls are all over some of these foraging beaches and they're eating the same food as we're looking for the shorebirds, but that tends to be before a lot of the shorebirds arrive. And then the gulls tend to move on to their nests for the summer. So all the birds that are here around May tend to be birds that are breeding here. And they then spend their time out in the marshes. A lot of them nest in giant colonies out in the inland bays. So those gulls kind of clear out of the area in a big way, and they're spending more time around their own nests, and we don't see that much competition. There's always gulls on the beaches with the shorebirds. And for some species that may be more sensitive to that, they may be pushed out of certain areas because of gulls, certainly, but I wouldn't guess that it's a large scale problem because those giant flocks of gulls mainly move into marshy areas away from the shorebirds during that time. It's not something we worry about super intensely, but that could change. If there's a massive change in where the gulls are spending time or the general population numbers, it could be something we were more worried about. The gulls are also very generalist eaters, so while they'll eat horseshoe crabs when they're in front of them, they're not necessarily super specifically having to target horseshoe crabs, and they may find that their food sources are more spread out and they might not spend nearly as much time around these big horseshoe crab egg gatherings as some of these shorebirds will. I think that's the last one that's come in. So I'll stick around for a couple more minutes if anybody wants to ask anything, but also feel free to email me if you had any questions that you didn't get answered now. And thanks everybody for joining. It was great to get to talk about this.